The morning they put my father in the ground, my phone rang twice. I let the first call go to voicemail. I was standing at the graveside in a gray suit I hadn't worn since my youngest daughter's college graduation, watching them lower a mahogany casket into the Georgia clay, and I wasn't ready to be Harold Merritt, retired electrical engineer, available for phone calls. I was just a son, just a 63-year-old man who still couldn't quite believe his father was gone. The second call came 4 minutes later, from the same number, a 404 area code I didn't recognize. My brother Gary shot me a look from across the grave. I silenced the phone and put it back in my pocket. It wasn't until we were walking back to the cars, the preacher shaking hands and my sister-in-law passing out those little prayer cards with Dad's photo on them, that I listened to the voicemail. Harold, this is Clifton Webb. I was your father's attorney for the last 11 years. I need you to come to my office today, if at all possible. I know the timing is terrible and I'm deeply sorry for your loss, but I made a promise to your father, and I intend to keep it. Please don't mention this call to your brother. Come alone. I stood by my car in the cemetery parking lot and played the message again. Don't mention this call to your brother. Gary was 40 feet away, one arm around his wife, Patrice, accepting a casserole dish from one of Dad's neighbors. He looked the way I felt, worn down, hollowed out, like something essential had been removed. I had no reason not to trust Gary. We'd been close our whole lives. He'd driven up from Savannah the moment I called to tell him Dad was in the hospital. He'd sat with me in that waiting room for 6 hours. He'd cried at the service, genuine tears, the kind you can't fake. And yet, I found myself texting Clifton Webb back, telling him I'd be there by 3 o'clock, and I didn't say a word to my brother. Dad had been 79 years old. Walter Eugene Merritt, retired high school principal, deacon of his church, a man who still mowed his own lawn every Saturday morning until about 8 months ago, when his knees finally convinced him to buy a riding mower. He'd been sharp as a tack his entire life, the kind of man who did his own taxes, balanced his checkbook to the penny, remembered the name of every student he'd ever had. His decline had been sudden. That was the part that still didn't sit right with me. It started about 14 months ago. He began calling me by the wrong name sometimes, mixing me up with Gary, which had never happened before. He left the stove on twice. He missed a doctor's appointment he'd had on the calendar for months. At first I told myself it was grief. He'd lost my mother, Carol, 2 years prior, and everyone processes that differently. But when he called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night asking if I knew where Carol was, I started to worry in a different way. The doctors said it was the early stages of vascular dementia. Not Alzheimer's, but similar enough. They said it could progress slowly or quickly, that there was no way to know. They gave him some medication to help manage the symptoms. That's when Gary suggested Dad might need more help than I could provide, from 2 hours away. I lived in Marietta. Gary lived 45 minutes from Dad's house in Brunswick, and Patrice had left her job at the school district the year before, so she had time. It made logical sense. Gary moved into Dad's spare bedroom and took over managing the household, the grocery runs, the medication schedule, the doctor's appointments. Dad seemed happy to have family close. He and Gary had always had an easy relationship, the kind of low-maintenance bond that middle children sometimes build with parents. I came down every 3 weeks or so. I called every few days. Dad always sounded okay on the phone, a little confused sometimes, repeating himself, but okay. 8 months into this arrangement, I visited and noticed that Dad seemed worse than usual. Not just confused, distant, glassy in a way that troubled me. I mentioned it to Gary, who said the doctor had recently adjusted his medication dosage. I asked which doctor, and Gary gave me a name I didn't recognize. I asked about his usual physician, Dr. Anita Forsyth, and Gary said Dad had switched. I didn't push back. I probably should have. Here is something I've learned too late, friends. When your instincts tell you something doesn't add up, they are almost always doing the math correctly. I drove to Clifton Webb's office on the east side of town, a brick building tucked between an insurance agency and a hardware store, and I sat down across from a man in his late 60s with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a yellow legal pad in front of him. He'd been practicing law in that county for 34 years. He'd handled my parents' estate planning since shortly after my mother was diagnosed with her own illness, a decade ago. He thanked me for coming, and then he set a manila folder on the desk between us. Your father came to see me 7 months ago, he said. In person, without Gary, on a day when he told your brother he was going to a church elder meeting. He drove himself. I want you to understand that, because I know what you're probably thinking, that Walter wasn't in a condition to make clear decisions. He was. Whatever is happening to him now, 7 months ago, your father was as lucid as you or I. He was frightened, and he was very specific about what he needed me to do. I didn't say anything. I just looked at that folder. He'd been reviewing his financial statements. Clifton continued, and he'd noticed some things he couldn't account for. Transfers he hadn't authorized. Withdrawals from the account he kept separately, the one with his and your mother's retirement savings. He'd initially tried to raise it with Gary, and Gary had an explanation for everything: a plumbing repair, a property tax issue, a medical bill that insurance hadn't covered. But the numbers kept coming. And your father, who balanced his checkbook to the penny for 50 years, knew that something was wrong. How much? I said. Clifton opened the folder. In the 14 months since Gary had moved into Dad's house, approximately $187,000 had been moved out of my father's accounts. It hadn't gone all at once. It had gone in increments: 4,000 here, 6,000 there, a wire transfer for 11,000 that was listed in the memo line as home repairs. There were also 2 changes to Dad's investment accounts that required a signature. And when Clifton showed me the signatures on those documents, I felt the floor shift beneath me. They were close, but they weren't my father's handwriting. He knew, I said. He knew, Clifton confirmed. He also suspected that his medication situation had been tampered with. He couldn't prove it, but he felt that the symptoms he was experiencing were sometimes worse than at other times, and he couldn't tell whether that was the disease or something else. He didn't want to accuse his son without proof, and he was afraid that if Gary knew he was suspicious, whatever evidence existed would disappear. So my father had done something that I think is one of the bravest and most heartbreaking things I've ever heard. He'd come to his attorney alone and in secret. He'd handed Clifton copies of every financial document he could get his hands on: bank statements, withdrawal slips, account change authorizations. He'd written a 13-page document by hand, in his careful schoolteacher's cursive, describing every suspicious incident he could remember, with dates and amounts and whatever details he could recall. And he'd asked Clifton to hold everything, to reach out to me the day he passed, and to please make sure Harold saw it before Gary had the opportunity to get to the estate. He hadn't wanted to tear the family apart on a suspicion that turned out to be wrong. He'd wanted the truth to come out through the right channels, with evidence, with his words attached, so it couldn't be dismissed. My father, the principal, even at the end, he was thinking about the process, about fairness, about making sure the record was clear. I sat in that office for a long time after Clifton finished talking. My suit jacket was still on. I hadn't even loosened my tie. He wrote you something, Clifton said, and he handed me an envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting, which I recognized the way you recognize someone's voice. I'm not going to share everything in that letter, because some of it was private, but I'll tell you what he said at the end of it, because it's the part I keep coming back to. He wrote, "I am not angry at your brother. I am sad for him. A man who would steal from his father and deceive his family has already lost something that money cannot buy back. Do what is right, Harold. That's all I ever asked of either of you." I drove back to my father's house, the house I grew up in, with the big magnolia in the front yard and the screened-in porch where Dad used to drink his coffee every morning, and I sat in my car in the driveway for about 20 minutes. Then I went inside. Gary and Patrice were in the kitchen. There were people around, a few of Dad's church friends, a neighbor who'd brought food. Gary handed me a plate, and I sat down at the table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning until I was 18 years old. And I looked at my brother, and I thought about what my father had written. A man who would steal from his father. "You okay?" Gary asked me. "Not really," I said, which was true. I stayed through the evening. I helped with the dishes. I talked to the neighbors about Dad. And the whole time I watched Gary, the way he moved through that house like he'd always been the one in charge of it, the way he directed people to where things were kept, the way Patrice touched his arm and whispered something to him when she thought no one was watching. She looked nervous. She'd looked nervous all day. I'd attributed it to grief, the way you attribute everything to the most obvious explanation when you're in the middle of loss. I drove back to my hotel that night, and I called my daughter Renee, who is a licensed financial investigator in Atlanta and has been for 12 years. "Dad," she said, after I'd told her everything, "that's wire fraud, and potentially elder abuse, which is a separate charge in Georgia. And if the medication situation can be proven, it opens up something much more serious. How do we prove the medication situation? We start by contacting his real doctor," she said, "Dr. Forsyth. And then we find out who this new doctor is that Gary brought in. And then we get Dad's pharmacy records and compare them to what he was actually taking." I want to pause here for a moment, because I think some of you listening to this might be asking the same question I've wrestled with ever since. Why didn't Dad just call me directly when he first suspected something was wrong? Why the secrecy? The attorney? The letter? Why not just pick up the phone? I've thought about this for a long time, and I think I understand it now. He was ashamed, not of Gary, but for Gary. He was a man who had spent 40 years building young people up, believing in redemption, choosing patience over punishment. He loved his son. He didn't want to blow up Gary's life on a suspicion. He wanted to be sure. And he was afraid that if he told me and I came down here hot and accusatory and it turned out he was wrong, it would destroy the family permanently. He was protecting everyone, even the person who was stealing from him. That's who my father was. And understanding that made me grieve him in a completely different way. Renee came to Brunswick 3 days later. Between the two of us and Clifton Webb, we assembled a picture that was thorough and damning. Gary had added himself to 3 of my father's accounts 14 months ago. Shortly after moving in, using a durable power of attorney that my father said he had never signed. A handwriting expert later confirmed that the signature was not Walter Merritt's. The $187,000 had been distributed across 2 personal accounts in Gary and Patrice's names, used for things like a truck payment, a renovation on their Savannah home, a credit card balance, and what appeared to be a down payment on a piece of land in South Carolina. The doctor Gary had switched Dad to was a real physician, but one who operated a small practice on the edge of town and who, we would later learn, had a history of writing prescriptions with very little clinical oversight. Dad's medication had been changed to a combination that, according to a neurologist Renee hired to review the record, was not appropriate for his presentation and would have accelerated cognitive decline while also causing physical fatigue and confusion. The neurologist used the phrase consistent with intentional dosage manipulation in her written assessment. That phrase didn't leave me alone for a very long time. My brother had medicated my father into a state where he seemed sicker and more dependent than he actually was, and then used that apparent dependency to justify the financial control, and then siphoned off the money piece by piece while we were all watching my father decline and thinking it was just the disease. I brought everything to the county sheriff's department and to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's elder fraud unit. I want to be clear about that. I didn't confront Gary myself first. I went to law enforcement. My father had asked me to do what was right, and the right thing was not a kitchen table argument with my brother. It was making sure this went somewhere it couldn't be buried. The investigators moved quickly once they had the documentation Clifton had preserved. The forged power of attorney was the clearest and cleanest piece of evidence. That alone is a felony in Georgia, and it established the framework for everything that followed. They arrested Gary on a Thursday morning, 8 days after Dad's funeral. Patrice was arrested the same day. I wasn't there when it happened. I was back in Marietta. Renee called me and I sat down on the back porch and stared at the tree line for about 10 minutes without saying anything. I don't know what I felt. Relief wasn't the right word. Justice felt too clean. Mostly I felt tired and sad and grateful that my father had been smart enough and brave enough to leave a paper trail, and I felt guilty that he'd felt he had to do it alone. Gary was charged with elder financial exploitation, forgery, and exploitation of an at-risk adult. Patrice was charged with financial exploitation as a co-conspirator. Given the evidence Renee helped compile on the medication situation, the DA added a charge of reckless endangerment related to the prescription manipulation. Getting that charge to stick required the neurologist's testimony, the pharmacy records, and documentation showing that Gary had specifically requested the medication change from the new physician without informing Dad's longtime doctor. Gary ultimately pleaded guilty to elder financial exploitation and forgery in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received 4 years, with the possibility of parole after 2.5. Patrice received 18 months and probation. The reckless endangerment charge was reduced as part of the plea agreement, which I fought and ultimately had to accept. I want to be honest with you about that because I know some of you are going to feel the way I felt, that it wasn't enough. That 4 years is not commensurate with what was done to a 79-year-old man who'd spent his life doing right by other people. I am not at peace with the sentence. I don't think I ever will be. But the DA explained to me that the alternative was a trial that could have taken 2 years and might have ended in acquittal on some charges due to the complexity of proving the medication component. My father would have wanted the certainty over the gamble. I made the call I thought he would have made. Through the civil proceedings that followed the criminal case, I recovered $161,000 of the $187,000, the bulk of what had been taken. The remainder had been spent in ways that couldn't be fully clawed back. The land in South Carolina was sold, and the proceeds returned to the estate. Dad's investment accounts were restored to their proper structure. I had the house cleaned and repainted. I sat on the screened porch with a cup of coffee on a Saturday morning. which is something I hadn't done in years. Not since I was a teenager getting up early to sit with Dad before anyone else was awake. The magnolia was still there. The porch swing still creaked on the left side, the way it always had. I still have the letter he wrote me. I've read it probably 40 times. The handwriting is a little shakier than it used to be, but the sentences are precise and clear, and entirely him. He signed it the way he signed everything, Walter E. Merritt, like even a letter to his own son, deserved his full, formal name. There are things I wish had gone differently. I wish he'd called me sooner. I wish I had pushed harder when I noticed the changes in him, demanded to meet this new doctor, asked more questions about the accounts. I wish I had been less willing to accept Gary's explanations at face value, because I loved my brother, and it was easier to believe him than to imagine the alternative. I carry some portion of this, and I expect I always will. But I also know this. My father did not face what happened to him with passivity or confusion. He faced it with the same quiet, methodical dignity that he brought to everything in his life. He gathered his evidence. He protected the truth. He trusted the right person to hold it. And he left instructions that were clear enough that even a grieving son in a parking lot, listening to a voicemail he almost didn't check, could follow them to where they needed to go. He was a principal until the end, still looking out for the people he loved, still trying to make sure things came out right. If you are the adult child of an aging parent, please hear this. Get involved in the finances before a crisis forces you to. Know who their doctor is. Know who their attorney is. Know what accounts exist and what the signatures should look like. Not because every sibling is Gary, most aren't, but because your parents deserve to have someone paying attention, and the time to start paying attention is not after the damage is done. And if something feels wrong, even if you can't name exactly what it is, don't wait for certainty before you ask questions. My father waited for certainty. He had his reasons, and I will defend them because I understood the man. But the rest of us don't have to wait. Ask the questions. Make the call. Check the documents. That's what he would have told you.